If you're wrong, admit it. Just a minute's walk from my house was a wild stretch of virgin timber, where blackberry thickets foamed white in spring, squirrels nested and reared their young, and horseweeds grew as tall as a horse's head. This unspoiled woodland, called Forest Park, was a forest much like it was when Columbus discovered America. I often walked there with Rex, my small Boston bulldog. He was friendly and harmless, so I let him roam freely without a leash or muzzle since we rarely encountered anyone. One day, however, we met a mounted policeman eager to display his authority. "What do you mean by letting that dog run loose without a muzzle and leash?" he reprimanded. "Don't you know it's against the law?" "Yes, I know," I replied quietly. "But I didn't think he'd cause any harm out here." "You didn't think? The law doesn't care what you think. That dog might kill a squirrel or bite a child. Now, I'm letting you off this time, but if I catch him out here again without a muzzle and leash, you'll answer to the judge." I meekly promised to comply, and I did for a while. But Rex didn't like the muzzle, and neither did I. We decided to take a chance. Everything was fine for a while until one afternoon when we raced over a hill and, to my dismay, saw the same policeman. Rex was ahead of me, heading straight for him. I knew I was in trouble, so I didn't wait for him to speak. I beat him to it. "Officer, you've caught me red-handed. I'm guilty, with no alibis or excuses. You warned me that if I brought the dog out here without a muzzle again, I'd be fined." "Well now," the policeman responded in a softer tone, "I know it's tempting to let a little dog like that have a run when nobody's around." "Yes, but it's against the law," I admitted. "Well, a little dog like that won't harm anyone," he said. "No, but he could kill squirrels," I replied. "You're taking this a bit too seriously," he told me. "I'll tell you what, just let him run over the hill where I can't see him, and we'll forget about it." That policeman, being human, wanted to feel important, and by condemning myself, I allowed him to nourish his self-esteem by being magnanimous. If I had argued, the situation would have been different, but by quickly and openly admitting my fault, the matter ended graciously, with him taking my side. If you know you'll be rebuked anyway, isn't it better to beat the other person to it? It's easier to listen to self-criticism than endure condemnation from someone else. By admitting your faults before the other person does, you might inspire generosity and forgiveness, just as that policeman did with me. Ferdinand E. Warren, a commercial artist, applied this technique when dealing with a critical buyer. Warren knew the buyer loved finding fault in his work. One day, after delivering a rushed job, the buyer called him in, angry over a mistake. Instead of defending himself, Warren said, "If you're right, I'm at fault. There's no excuse for my blunder. I've been working for you long enough to know better." The buyer immediately softened, saying it wasn't a serious mistake. Warren insisted, though, that any mistake is irritating and offered to redo the work. The buyer protested, saying it wasn't worth the trouble and praised Warren's work, even taking him to lunch and giving him another commission. By criticizing himself, Warren took all the fight out of the buyer. There's satisfaction in admitting your mistakes. It clears the air and often solves the problem. Bruce Harvey, from Albuquerque, New Mexico, once authorized full wages for an employee on sick leave by mistake. When he realized it, he informed the employee and said he would have to reduce his next paycheck to correct the overpayment. The employee, facing financial difficulty, asked to repay the amount gradually. Harvey knew his boss would explode, so he admitted his fault immediately. Despite his boss initially blaming others, Harvey insisted it was his mistake. Finally, his boss acknowledged his admission and told him to straighten it out, respecting him more afterward. Admitting mistakes rather than defending them elevates us and garners respect. For example, General Robert E. Lee is remembered for taking full responsibility for the failure of Pickett's charge at Gettysburg. Despite having many valid excuses, Lee met his troops as they returned, defeated, and said, "All this has been my fault." Even in cultures where traditions may dictate otherwise, admitting fault can be powerful. In Hong Kong, a middle-aged man estranged from his son struggled with Chinese tradition, which dictates that elders should not take the first step toward reconciliation. Eventually, he realized that admitting his fault was more important than adhering to tradition. He sought his son's forgiveness, and their relationship was restored. Elbert Hubbard, a writer known for his controversial statements, often used this principle to turn enemies into friends. When criticized by readers, he would reply, agreeing with their points, disarming their hostility. When we're right, we should win people over gently. But when we're wrong, we should admit it quickly and with enthusiasm. This approach not only brings peace, but can lead to unexpected positive outcomes. As the proverb goes, by fighting, you never get enough, but by yielding, you get more than you expected. Principle 3. If you are wrong, admit it quickly and emphatically. A drop of honey. If your temper flares and you express your frustration toward someone, you may feel relief from unloading your emotions. But what about the other person? Will they experience the same satisfaction? Will your combative tone and aggressive attitude make it easier for them to see things your way? As Woodrow Wilson once said, "If you come at me with your fists doubled, I think I can promise you that mine will double as fast as yours. But if you come to me and say, 'Let us sit down and take counsel together.' If we differ from each other, let's understand why it is that we differ and pinpoint the real issues. We will soon find that our disagreements are fewer than expected, and the areas in which we agree are many. If we only exercise patience, honesty, and the desire to reconcile, we will eventually come together." No one appreciated the truth of Wilson's words more than John D. Rockefeller, Jr. Back in 1915, he was one of the most reviled men in Colorado. A bloody strike in American industrial history had gripped the state for 2 agonizing years. Miners, frustrated and belligerent, demanded higher wages from the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company, controlled by Rockefeller. Property was destroyed, the National Guard was called in, and blood was spilled. Strikers were shot, their bodies riddled with bullets. Yet, in the midst of all this animosity, Rockefeller sought to sway the strikers to his viewpoint, and he succeeded. How did he manage this? By first making friends. After weeks of fostering goodwill, Rockefeller addressed the representatives of the strikers. His speech, a masterclass in tact and diplomacy, produced extraordinary results. It calmed the raging sea of hatred that threatened to drown him and earned him many admirers. The workers returned to their posts without any further discussion of the wage increase for which they had fought so fiercely. The opening of that speech exemplifies his gentle, amicable approach. He spoke to the strikers, men who, only days earlier, were calling for his death, as if they were trusted friends. His address was filled with friendly expressions like, "I am proud to be here," "having visited your homes," and "we meet not as strangers, but as friends." Imagine if Rockefeller had approached these men differently. What if he had thrown cold, hard facts at them, undermined their struggles, and told them they were wrong? What would have happened? More anger, more hatred, more chaos. If someone's heart is filled with discord toward you, no amount of logic will win them over. Parents who scold, bosses who dominate, and spouses who nag must realize that people are resistant to changing their minds when forced. But with gentleness and a friendly attitude, they may be led to change. Abraham Lincoln echoed this sentiment over a century ago when he said, "A drop of honey catches more flies than a gallon of gall." To win someone to your cause, begin by convincing them that you are their sincere friend. That drop of honey will capture their heart. And once you have their heart, you have taken the first step to reaching their mind. Business leaders have also learned the value of friendliness when dealing with strikers. Take, for example, the 2,500 employees of the White Motor Company who went on strike for higher wages and a union shop. Robert F. Black, then president of the company, didn't react with anger. Instead, he praised the workers for the peaceful manner in which they had stopped work. He even provided baseball equipment for the strikers to use on vacant lots and rented a bowling alley for those who preferred it. His friendliness produced the expected result. The strikers responded in kind, cleaning up around the factory grounds. Such a scene was unheard of in American labor history. The strike ended within a week, without any bitterness or rancor. Daniel Webster, one of the greatest advocates in American history, was also known for his friendly approach. He began his most powerful arguments with humble phrases like, "It will be for the jury to consider," or, "Here are some facts that I trust you will not overlook." He didn't bulldoze people into agreeing with him. Instead, he employed a quiet, respectful manner, and this helped make him one of the most successful lawyers of his time. Even in smaller, everyday matters, a friendly approach can make all the difference. O.L. Straub, an engineer, once faced a tough situation with a landlord who was notorious for being difficult. Rather than confront the landlord with demands, Straub complimented him on how well he managed the building. This friendly approach led to an unexpected result. The landlord not only reduced Straub's rent, but also offered to redecorate the apartment. Dean Woodcock, a superintendent at an electric company in Pittsburgh, found himself in a potentially embarrassing situation when a photographer began taking pictures of what appeared to be overstaffing at a job site. Recognizing the potential for bad publicity, Woodcock approached the photographer in a friendly manner and explained the unusual circumstances. The photographer appreciated the explanation, put away his camera, and even shook Woodcock's hand before leaving. The power of gentleness and friendliness is timeless. As illustrated by the fable of the sun and the wind, the sun's warmth caused a man to remove his coat, while the wind's force only made him hold onto it tighter. Gentleness can achieve what force cannot. F. Gail Connor of Lutherville, Maryland, experienced this firsthand when dealing with a car dealership's service department. After facing repeated issues with his car, Connor approached the dealership owner in a friendly manner. The owner, impressed by Connor's calm and respectful attitude, personally ensured the problem was resolved and even lent Connor his own car in the meantime. Aesop, the Greek slave who lived 600 years before Christ, understood this truth about human nature. His fables, like the one about the wind and the sun, continue to resonate today. Kindness and appreciation can change hearts and minds more effectively than aggression or force. As Lincoln wisely said, "A drop of honey catches more flies than a gallon of gall." The secret of Socrates. When engaging in conversations with people, don't start by discussing areas of disagreement. Instead, begin by emphasizing and continue to emphasize the points on which you both agree. Keep highlighting, if possible, that you're both working toward the same goal, with only a difference in methods, not purpose. Get the other person to say, "Yes, yes," right from the beginning. Try to avoid letting the other party say, "No." According to Professor Overstreet, a no is one of the toughest obstacles to overcome. When someone says no, their pride compels them to stay consistent. Even if later they feel that saying no was a mistake, their pride makes it difficult to change. Once someone has committed to a statement, they feel the need to stand by it. Hence, it is crucial to start someone off in the affirmative direction. Harry A. Overstreet, Influencing Human Behavior. New York, Norton, 1925. A skilled speaker will gather several yes responses at the outset. This sets the listener's psychological momentum in an affirmative direction, much like a billiard ball that, once set in motion, requires significant force to change direction, let alone reverse it. The psychological patterns here are clear. When someone says no and truly means it, they do more than just utter a two-letter word. Their entire organism, glandular, nervous, and muscular, engages in a state of rejection. Often there's even a subtle but observable physical withdrawal. The whole neuromuscular system braces itself against acceptance. In contrast, when someone says yes, none of those defensive reactions occur. The organism assumes a forward-moving, receptive attitude. Therefore, the more yeses we can obtain at the outset, the better our chances of capturing attention for our ultimate proposition. This technique of eliciting a yes is remarkably simple, yet it is often overlooked. People sometimes seem to take pride in antagonizing others at the start. When you get a student, customer, child, spouse, or anyone else to say no at the beginning, it takes angelic wisdom and patience to turn that defensive negative into an affirmative. For example, James Eberson, a teller at the Greenwich Savings Bank in New York City, used the yes technique to secure a prospective customer who might have otherwise been lost. "A man came in to open an account," said Mr. Eberson, "and I handed him our usual form to fill out. He willingly answered some questions, but flatly refused to answer others. Before I studied human relations, I would have told him that if he refused to provide this information, we couldn't open his account. I'm embarrassed to admit that I had done this in the past. Issuing an ultimatum like that made me feel powerful, as if I were showing that the bank's rules couldn't be ignored. However, that attitude certainly didn't make the customer feel welcome. This time, I decided to use a little common sense. I focused on the customer's needs instead of the bank's, and above all, I aimed to get him saying yes, yes, from the start. I told him that the information he refused to provide wasn't absolutely necessary. However, I said, if you pass away with money in this bank, wouldn't you want it transferred to your next of kin? Yes, of course, he replied. Don't you think it would be wise to provide the name of your next of kin so that in the event of your death, we could execute your wishes without error or delay? Again, he said, yes. His attitude softened once he realized that we weren't asking for this information for the bank's sake, but for his own. Before leaving, he not only provided full information, but also opened a trust account, naming his mother as the beneficiary and answering all questions about her as well. I discovered that by getting him to say yes, yes from the start, he forgot the original issue and happily did everything I suggested. Joseph Allison, a sales representative for Westinghouse Electric Company, shared a similar story. There was a man in my territory whom our company had been trying to sell to for 10 years without success. When I took over the territory, I called on him consistently for 3 years without any results. Finally, after 13 years of effort, we sold him a few motors, expecting that a larger order for several hundred more would follow if these motors performed well. Confident that they would, I visited him 3 weeks later in high spirits, only to be met with a startling announcement. "Allison, I can't buy the rest of the motors from you." "Why?" I asked in surprise. "Because your motors are too hot. I can't even touch them." I knew arguing wouldn't help, so I focused on getting a yes response. "Well, Mr. Smith, I completely agree. If the motors are running too hot, you shouldn't buy more. You need motors that meet the standards set by the National Electrical Manufacturers Association, right?" He agreed, and I got my first yes. Now, those standards allow for a motor temperature of 72 degrees Fahrenheit above room temperature, correct? Again, he said, "Yes." "But your motors are hotter," he added. I didn't argue. Instead, I asked, "How hot is the mill room?" "About 75 degrees Fahrenheit," he replied. "So if you add 72 degrees to that, you get 147 degrees Fahrenheit. Wouldn't you scald your hand under hot water at 147 degrees? Once again, he had to say, "Yes." "So, wouldn't it be a good idea to keep your hands off those motors?" He admitted I was right. We continued talking, and by the end of the conversation, he ordered $35,000 worth of motors for the following month. It took me years to learn that arguing doesn't pay. It's much more profitable and interesting to look at things from the other person's perspective and get them to say, "Yes, yes." Similarly, Eddie Snow, who sponsors our courses in Oakland, California, became a loyal customer to a store because the owner got him to say, "Yes, yes." Eddie had become interested in bow hunting and had spent a lot on equipment at a local store. When his brother visited, he wanted to rent a bow, but the clerk told him they didn't rent bows. Eddie called another shop, where a polite gentleman told him they no longer rented bows because it wasn't profitable. He asked if Eddie had rented before, to which Eddie said, "Yes." The man then asked if Eddie liked saving money, which of course led to another "yes." He then explained that for only $4.95 more than the rental price, Eddie could buy a bow set. Eddie agreed it was a reasonable deal, which led to the purchase of the set and additional items, and Eddie becoming a regular customer. Socrates, the gadfly of Athens, was one of the greatest philosophers in history. He didn't tell people they were wrong. Instead, his method, known today as the Socratic method, focused on getting a yes response. He asked questions his opponents would have to agree with, leading them to a conclusion they would have denied moments earlier. The next time we feel the urge to tell someone they're wrong, let's remember Socrates and ask a gentle question to get a yes, yes response. As the Chinese proverb wisely says, "He who treads softly goes far." After 5,000 years of studying human nature, the Chinese have indeed gathered a wealth of wisdom. He who treads softly goes far. Principle 5. Get the other person to say yes, yes immediately. The safety valve in handling complaints. Most people trying to win others over to their way of thinking tend to talk too much themselves. Instead, let the other person talk themselves out. They know more about their business and problems than you do, so it's essential to ask them questions and let them speak. If you find yourself disagreeing with them, you might be tempted to interrupt, but avoid this. It can be dangerous. They won't listen to you while they still have a lot of ideas in their mind waiting to be expressed. Instead, listen patiently and with an open mind. Be genuine in your approach and encourage them to fully express their ideas. Does this method work in business? Let's explore a case where it did. A sales representative found himself forced to adopt this approach. One of the largest automobile manufacturers in the United States was in the process of selecting a year's supply of upholstery fabrics. 3 major manufacturers had submitted sample fabrics, and the executives of the motor company had inspected them. Each supplier received notice that a representative would be given the opportunity to make a final pitch for the contract on a certain day. GBR, a representative of one of the manufacturers, arrived in town with a severe case of laryngitis. When it was my turn to meet the executives, Mr. R said, relating the story to one of my classes, I had lost my voice entirely. I could barely whisper. I was brought into a room where I faced the textile engineer, the purchasing agent, the director of sales, and the company president. I stood up and tried to speak, but all I could manage was a faint squeak. I wrote on a pad of paper, "Gentlemen, I have lost my voice. I am speechless." The president kindly offered to do the talking for me. He then proceeded to show my samples and highlight their positive aspects. A lively discussion ensued about the merits of my product, and since the president was speaking on my behalf, he took the position I would have argued for. My involvement was limited to nodding, smiling, and a few gestures. As a result of this unique meeting, I was awarded the contract, which amounted to over 500,000 yards of upholstery fabrics, valued at $1.6 million, the largest order I ever received. I realize now that I would have likely lost the contract if I hadn't lost my voice, because I had completely misread the situation. By letting the other person do the talking, I inadvertently stumbled upon a highly effective strategy. Allowing the other person to speak doesn't just apply in business. It works in family relationships too. Barbara Wilson experienced this firsthand with her daughter Lori. Lori, once a quiet and complacent child, had become a rebellious and sometimes hostile teenager. Mrs. Wilson tried lecturing, threatening, and punishing Lori, but nothing worked. One day, Mrs. Wilson shared with one of our classes, I had simply reached my breaking point. Lori had once again disobeyed me, leaving the house before finishing her chores. When she returned, I was ready to yell at her again, but I was too exhausted to do it. Instead, I just looked at her and asked, "Why, Lori? Why?" To my surprise, Lori calmly responded, "Do you really want to know?" I nodded, and she began to explain. First hesitantly, but then everything poured out. I realized that I had never truly listened to her. I was always telling her what to do, and when she tried to share her thoughts or feelings, I interrupted with more instructions. Lori needed me not as an authority figure, but as someone she could confide in, someone to help her process the confusion of growing up. But all I had done was talk, when I should have been listening. From that day forward, I let Lori talk as much as she wanted, and our relationship improved dramatically. She became cooperative again. The value of listening is also critical in professional contexts. For instance, a large advertisement appeared in a New York newspaper calling for someone with exceptional abilities. Charles T. Kubelis responded to the ad, sending his reply to a box number. Shortly after, he was invited for an interview. Before attending, he spent hours researching everything he could about the company's founder. During the interview, Kubelis commented, "I would be extremely proud to be part of an organization with a history like yours. I understand you started the company 28 years ago with just a desk and a stenographer. Is that true?" Nearly every successful person enjoys reminiscing about their early struggles, and this employer was no different. He spent a long time recounting how he started with just $450 and an idea, how he faced discouragement and ridicule, working long hours, even on Sundays and holidays, before finally overcoming all odds. Now, some of the top executives on Wall Street were turning to him for guidance. He was justifiably proud of his accomplishments, and he relished the opportunity to share his story. The employer asked Kubelis only a few brief questions about his own experience before calling in a vice president and saying, "I think this is the person we've been looking for." Kubelis had taken the time to show interest in the other person's journey, encouraging them to talk, which ultimately made a favorable impression. Roy G. Bradley of Sacramento, California, found himself in a situation where listening helped him secure a promising hire. Bradley's firm was small and couldn't offer many of the benefits larger companies could, such as medical insurance or pensions. However, Richard Pryor, a potential sales candidate, had the kind of experience they were seeking. Pryor's initial interview left him discouraged due to the lack of benefits. However, as Bradley listened, Pryor began to reflect on the advantages of being an independent contractor, gradually talking himself into the role. Bradley avoided interrupting or adding to Pryor's thoughts, and by the end of the conversation, Pryor had convinced himself that working for the firm would be a rewarding challenge. Bradley hired him, and Pryor became one of the company's top representatives. This principle also applies in friendships. People would rather talk about their achievements than hear about yours. La Rochefoucauld, the French philosopher, famously said, "If you want enemies, excel your friends, but if you want friends, let your friends excel you." When friends excel, they feel important. But if you surpass them, they may feel inferior or envious. Henrietta G., a placement counselor in New York, learned this lesson after initially alienating her colleagues by constantly bragging about her achievements. Eventually, she realized that by listening and showing interest in their successes, she could foster stronger relationships. Her colleagues were eager to share their accomplishments, and her relationships with them improved when she focused more on listening than boasting. Principle 6. Let the other person do a great deal of the talking. How to gain cooperation. Do you have more faith in ideas that you discover for yourself than in ideas handed to you on a silver platter? If so, then isn't it bad judgment to try to force your opinions on others? Isn't it better to make suggestions and let the other person reach the conclusion on their own? This principle was effectively demonstrated by Adolf Seltz of Philadelphia, a sales manager in an automobile showroom and a student in one of my courses. One day, he found himself facing the challenge of motivating a discouraged and disorganized group of salespeople. He called a sales meeting and asked his team to tell him exactly what they expected from him. As they shared their thoughts, he wrote their ideas on the blackboard. After they finished, he said, "I'll give you all the qualities you expect from me. Now, I want you to tell me what I have a right to expect from you." The responses came fast: loyalty, honesty, initiative, optimism, teamwork, and 8 hours of enthusiastic work each day. The meeting ended on a high note, with renewed courage and inspiration. One salesperson even volunteered to work 14 hours a day. Later, Mr. Seltz told me that the increase in sales was phenomenal. "The people had made a sort of moral bargain with me," he said, "and as long as I upheld my end of it, they were determined to uphold theirs. Consulting them about their desires was the boost they needed." No one likes to feel they are being sold something or told what to do. We prefer to feel that we are making decisions of our own accord or acting on our own ideas. We enjoy being consulted about our thoughts, wishes, and wants. Consider the case of Eugene Wesson, who lost thousands of dollars in commissions before learning this truth. Wesson sold sketches for a studio that designed patterns for stylists and textile manufacturers. For 3 years, he visited one of New York's leading stylists once a week. The stylist always reviewed his sketches carefully, but never bought anything. "He never refused to see me," Wesson said, "but he never purchased. He would always look over my sketches and then say, 'No, Wesson, I don't think we'll get any today.'" After 150 failures, Wesson realized he must be stuck in a mental rut. So, he resolved to spend one evening a week studying how to influence human behavior, to develop new ideas and generate fresh enthusiasm. He decided to change his approach. With a few unfinished sketches under his arm, he rushed to the buyer's office. "I need a favor," he said. "These are some uncompleted sketches. Could you please tell me how we could finish them so that they would meet your needs?" The buyer looked at the sketches in silence for a while and then said, "Leave them with me for a few days, Wesson, and come back later." Wesson returned 3 days later, received suggestions from the buyer, took the sketches back to the studio, and had them finished according to the buyer's preferences. The result? Every sketch was accepted. From that point on, the buyer ordered many more sketches from Wesson, all drawn to the buyer's specifications. "I realized why I had failed for so long," said Wesson. "I was trying to get him to buy what I thought he should have. Then, I changed my approach completely and asked for his ideas. This made him feel like he was creating the designs. And, in fact, he was. I didn't have to sell anything. He was buying. This principle, allowing the other person to feel that the idea is theirs, not only works in business and politics, but also in family life. Paul M. Davis of Tulsa, Oklahoma, shared an example from his own life. My family and I had one of the most interesting vacations we've ever taken. For years, I had wanted to visit historic sites like the Civil War battlefield at Gettysburg, Independence Hall in Philadelphia, and the nation's capital. Places like Valley Forge, Jamestown, and the restored colonial village of Williamsburg were also high on my list of must-see spots. But in March, my wife Nancy mentioned that she had ideas for our summer vacation as well. Her plan was to tour the western states, visiting attractions in New Mexico, Arizona, California, and Nevada. She had wanted to take this trip for years, but it was clear we couldn't do both. Our daughter Anne had just finished a course in U.S. history and had become deeply interested in the events that shaped the growth of our country. I asked her how she would feel about visiting the places she'd studied on our next vacation. She was excited about the idea. A couple of evenings later, during dinner, Nancy announced that if we all agreed, our summer vacation would be to the eastern states, saying it would be a great trip for Anne and enjoyable for all of us. We all readily agreed. The same principle was used by an X-ray manufacturer to sell his equipment to one of Brooklyn's largest hospitals. The hospital was building an addition and preparing to equip it with the finest X-ray department in the country. Dr. L, who was in charge of the department, was overwhelmed by sales representatives, each praising their own company's equipment. However, one manufacturer took a different approach. Instead of the usual sales pitch, he wrote a letter saying, "Our factory has recently developed a new line of X-ray equipment. The first shipment has just arrived, and we know the machines aren't perfect yet. We want to improve them and would greatly appreciate it if you could take some time to look them over and give us your feedback on how they could be made more suitable for your profession. Knowing how busy you are, I'll be happy to send a car for you at any time that's convenient." Dr. L was both surprised and flattered by the letter. "I had never had an X-ray manufacturer seek my advice before," he said. Although he was busy, he canceled a dinner engagement to look at the equipment. The more he studied it, the more he liked it. "No one tried to sell me anything," he said. "I felt like the decision to buy the equipment was entirely my own." In the end, he ordered it installed. Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote in his essay, Self-Reliance, "In every work of genius, we recognize our own rejected thoughts. They come back to us with a certain alienated majesty." Colonel Edward M. House exerted significant influence in both national and international affairs while Woodrow Wilson was in the White House. Wilson relied on Colonel House for secret counsel and advice, perhaps more than on his own cabinet members. How did House manage to influence the president? Fortunately, House himself revealed his method to Arthur D. Howden Smith, who later quoted him in an article in the Saturday Evening Post. "After I got to know the president," House said, "I learned that the best way to persuade him to adopt an idea was to plant it casually in his mind in a way that piqued his interest, so that he'd begin thinking about it on his own. The first time this happened, it was by accident. I had suggested a policy during a visit to the White House, and the president seemed to disapprove of it. But a few days later, at the dinner table, I was amazed to hear him present my idea as his own." Did House interrupt to claim credit? Number. He was too shrewd for that. He didn't care about getting credit. He wanted results. He let Wilson believe the idea was his. In fact, House went further. He publicly gave Wilson credit for the ideas. Let's remember that everyone we deal with is just as human as Woodrow Wilson. So, let's apply Colonel House's technique. A man in New Brunswick, Canada, used this technique on me and won my business. I was planning a fishing and canoeing trip in New Brunswick, and I had written to the Tourist Bureau for information. Soon, I was overwhelmed with dozens of letters, brochures, and testimonials from various camps and guides. I was confused and unsure of where to stay. Then, one camp owner did something clever. He sent me the names and phone numbers of several New Yorkers who had stayed at his camp and invited me to call them to hear their experiences firsthand. To my surprise, I recognized one of the names on the list. I called that person, heard about their positive experience, and immediately booked my stay at the camp. The other camp owners had tried to sell me on their services, but this one allowed me to make the decision myself and won my business. 25 centuries ago, the Chinese sage Lao Tse said something that readers of this book can still use today. The reason rivers and seas receive the homage of 100 mountain streams is that they stay below them. Thus, they are able to reign over all the mountain streams. So the sage, wishing to be above men, puts himself below them. Wishing to lead, he stays behind. Thus, though he is above men, they do not feel oppressed by his presence. Though he is in front, they do not resent being led. Principle 7. Let the other person feel that the idea is theirs. A formula that will work wonders for you. Always remember that although others may be completely wrong, they don't believe they are. Avoid condemning them. Anyone can do that. Instead, strive to understand them. It's the mark of wise, tolerant, and exceptional individuals to make this effort. There's always a reason behind a person's thoughts and actions. If you can uncover that reason, you will hold the key to understanding their behavior and even their personality. Try to sincerely put yourself in their shoes. Ask yourself, how would I feel and react if I were in their situation? Doing this will save you time and reduce frustration because, as the saying goes, by understanding the cause, we are less likely to dislike the effect. You'll also significantly improve your skills in human relationships. As Kenneth M. Good wrote in his book, How to Turn People into Gold, pause for a moment to contrast your deep concern for your own affairs with your mild concern for anything else. Then realize that everyone else in the world feels exactly the same way. Once you understand this, like Lincoln and Roosevelt, you will have grasped the most solid foundation for interpersonal relationships. Success in dealing with people hinges on a genuine understanding of their point of view. For example, Sam Douglas from Hempstead, New York, used to criticize his wife for spending too much time working on their lawn, pulling weeds, fertilizing, and cutting the grass twice a week, without noticing any improvement in its appearance. Naturally, his remarks upset her, and they often spoiled the rest of the evening. However, after attending a human relations course, Mr. Douglas realized how thoughtless he had been all those years. It had never occurred to him that his wife enjoyed the work and might appreciate a compliment for her efforts. One evening after dinner, she mentioned her plans to pull some weeds and invited him to join her. At first, he declined, but later reconsidered and went out to help. His wife was clearly pleased, and they spent the next hour working and enjoying pleasant conversation. From that point on, he frequently assisted her with the gardening, complimenting her on the excellent work she was doing with a yard where the soil was particularly challenging. The outcome? A happier relationship for both, because he had learned to view the situation from her perspective, even when it came to something as simple as weeding. In Getting Through to People, Dr. Gerald S. Nirenberg explains, cooperativeness in conversation is achieved when you demonstrate that you value the other person's ideas and feelings as much as your own. Beginning your conversation by stating its purpose or direction, guiding what you say according to what you would want to hear if you were the listener, and accepting their viewpoint will encourage them to approach your ideas with an open mind. I have always enjoyed walking and riding in a park near my home. Like the Druids of ancient Gaul, I have a deep reverence for oak trees, so it troubled me year after year to see young trees and shrubs destroyed by needless fires. These fires weren't caused by careless smokers. Rather, they were mostly the work of youngsters who ventured into the park to cook hot dogs or eggs under the trees. Some fires became so intense that the fire department had to be called in to handle them. Although a sign on the edge of the park warned that anyone starting a fire was subject to fines or imprisonment, it was posted in an infrequently visited part of the park, so few offenders ever saw it. A mounted policeman was assigned to monitor the park, but he did not take his duties seriously, and the fires continued to spread season after season. Once, I approached a policeman to report a rapidly spreading fire, asking him to notify the fire department, but he casually responded that it wasn't his responsibility because it was outside his precinct. Frustrated, I took matters into my own hands, becoming a self-appointed guardian of the public domain. At first, I didn't even attempt to understand the other people's viewpoints. When I saw a fire blazing under the trees, I became so upset and eager to correct the problem that I approached it the wrong way. I would ride up to the boys responsible, warn them that they could be jailed for starting a fire, and order them to put it out in an authoritative tone. If they refused, I would threaten to have them arrested. While they obeyed sullenly, they resented my approach and likely rebuilt the fire once I left. As the years passed, I gained a bit more knowledge of human relations, a touch more tact, and a greater ability to see things from other perspectives. Instead of giving orders, I would approach the boys in a friendly manner, saying something like, "Having a good time, boys? What's for supper?" I loved building fires when I was your age, and I still do. But, you know, fires can be dangerous here in the park. I'm sure you're being careful, but other boys may see your fire, build their own, and forget to put it out, leading to fires that spread and kill the trees. We won't have any trees left if we aren't more careful. You could even be fined or jailed for this, but I don't want to interfere with your fun. Could you rake the leaves away from the fire now and make sure to cover it with dirt when you're done? And next time, could you build your fire over the hill in the sand pit where it's safe? Thanks, boys. Have fun. This approach made a world of difference. The boys cooperated willingly, without resentment. They weren't forced to comply but chose to because I had considered their viewpoint. They felt better, and so did I, because I had handled the situation with respect for their perspective. Seeing things from another person's viewpoint can ease tension, especially when personal problems arise. Elizabeth Novak from New South Wales, Australia, was 6 weeks behind on her car payments. One Friday, she received a harsh phone call from her account manager, warning her that if she didn't pay $122 by Monday, further action would be taken. With no way to raise the money over the weekend, she expected the worst when he called again on Monday. However, instead of getting upset, she considered the situation from his perspective. She apologized sincerely for the inconvenience she had caused and acknowledged that she must be one of his most troublesome customers. His tone softened, and he reassured her that she wasn't among the worst. He even shared some examples of rude and dishonest customers he had dealt with. Elizabeth listened patiently, and without any prompting, he offered her an easier payment plan, allowing her to pay $20 by the end of the month and the rest when she could. Before asking anyone to do something, whether it's putting out a fire, buying your product, or contributing to a charity, take a moment to consider their perspective. Ask yourself, why would they want to do this? It takes time, but it prevents making enemies and achieves better results with less friction. As Dean Donham of Harvard Business School said, "I would rather spend 2 hours walking outside someone's office before an interview than go in without a clear idea of what I'm going to say and what they are likely to respond." If you take only one lesson from this text, let it be this. Cultivate the habit of seeing things from the other person's point of view. This practice could become one of the stepping stones of your career. Principle 8. Try sincerely to see things from the other person's point of view. What everybody wants. Wouldn't you like to have a magic phrase that would stop arguments, eliminate ill feelings, create goodwill, and make the other person listen attentively? The good news is, there is such a phrase. I don't blame you one bit for feeling the way you do. If I were in your position, I would undoubtedly feel the same. This response can soften even the most stubborn individual. And you can say it with absolute sincerity, because if you were the other person, with their background, experiences, and mindset, you would feel exactly as they do. Take Al Capone, for instance. Suppose you had inherited the same body, temperament, and mind that Al Capone had. Suppose you had experienced his environment and upbringing. You would then be precisely what he was, and where he was. It is those elements, and only those, that made him who he was. The only reason, for example, that you are not a rattlesnake is that your parents were not rattlesnakes. We deserve very little credit for being what we are. And similarly, people who come to you irate, biased, or irrational deserve very little discredit for being what they are. Feel sorry for them, pity them, sympathize with them. Say to yourself, there, but for the grace of God, go I. 3/4 of the people you meet are hungering and thirsting for sympathy. Give it to them, and they will love you. Once, I gave a broadcast about Louisa May Alcott, the author of Little Women. Naturally, I knew she had lived and written her beloved books in Concord, Massachusetts. But, without thinking, I mentioned visiting her old home in Concord, New Hampshire. If I had made the error just once, it might have been forgiven. But, unfortunately, I said it twice, and I was bombarded with letters and telegrams, furious messages swirling around me like a swarm of angry bees. Some were indignant, and a few were insulting. One particular letter came from a colonial dame who had been raised in Concord, Massachusetts, and was living in Philadelphia. She unleashed her fury on me, writing as if I had accused Miss Alcott of being a cannibal from New Guinea. As I read the letter, I thought to myself, thank goodness I'm not married to that woman. I felt the urge to write back and tell her that while I had made a geographic mistake, she had made an even greater mistake in common courtesy. That was going to be just my opening sentence. After that, I intended to really give her a piece of my mind. But I didn't. I controlled myself, realizing that any hot-headed fool could do that. I wanted to be above fools. So I decided to try to turn her hostility into friendliness. I said to myself, if I were her, I would probably feel the same way. So I determined to sympathize with her viewpoint. The next time I was in Philadelphia, I called her. Our conversation went like this. Me. Mrs. Name, you wrote me a letter a few weeks ago, and I want to thank you for it. Her, in a sharp, cultured tone, to whom am I speaking? Me. I am a stranger to you. My name is Dale Carnegie. You listened to a broadcast I gave about Louisa May Alcott a few Sundays ago, and I made the inexcusable mistake of saying that she had lived in Concord, New Hampshire. It was a stupid blunder, and I apologize. It was very kind of you to take the time to write to me. Her, I am sorry, Mr. Carnegie, that I wrote what I did. I lost my temper, and I must apologize. Me, no, you are not the one to apologize. I am. Any school child would have known better than to say what I said. I apologized on air the following Sunday, and I want to personally apologize to you now. Her, I was born in Concord, Massachusetts. My family has been prominent in Massachusetts for 2 centuries, and I am very proud of my state. I was quite distressed to hear you say Miss Alcott had lived in New Hampshire, but I am ashamed of the letter I wrote. Me. I assure you, Mrs. Name, you were not 1/10 as distressed as I was. My mistake didn't hurt Massachusetts, but it certainly hurt me. It is rare for someone of your standing to take the time to write, and I hope you will write again if you ever hear another mistake in one of my broadcasts. Her. You know, I really appreciate how graciously you've accepted my criticism. You must be a very nice person. I'd like to get to know you better. By sympathizing with her point of view and apologizing, she began to apologize and sympathize with mine. I had the satisfaction of controlling my temper, returning kindness for an insult, and ultimately gaining her friendship. I derived far more enjoyment from making her like me than I would have from telling her to go jump in the Schuylkill River. Every president faces thorny problems in human relations. President Taft was no exception. In his book Ethics in Service, Taft shared a story that illustrates the power of sympathy in dissolving hard feelings. A woman in Washington, whose husband held political influence, spent 6 weeks trying to secure a position for her son. She enlisted senators and congressmen to support her cause, but despite her efforts, Taft appointed someone else based on qualifications. She wrote Taft an angry letter, accusing him of ingratitude. Taft, instead of reacting immediately, waited a couple of days and then wrote a polite letter explaining that the position required technical qualifications and that he had to follow the recommendations of the department. His sympathetic approach mollified the woman, and she apologized. Later, Taft received another letter, this time supposedly from the woman's husband, though it was written in the same handwriting. The letter claimed that the woman had developed a serious case of stomach cancer due to her disappointment. Once again, Taft wrote back sympathetically, expressing hope that the diagnosis was incorrect. The man Taft appointed was eventually confirmed, and just days later, Taft and his wife were greeted at a White House event by none other than the supposedly gravely ill woman and her husband. Jay Mangum, a representative for an elevator maintenance company, dealt with a hotel manager who didn't want to shut down an escalator for repairs. Instead of arguing, Jay sympathized with the manager's desire to minimize inconvenience for the guests. He calmly explained that delaying repairs could cause more severe damage, leading to a longer shutdown. The manager, seeing Jay's point, agreed to the necessary repairs. Piano teacher Joyce Norris faced a different kind of challenge. One of her students, Babette, had long fingernails, which made it difficult for her to play properly. Instead of demanding that Babette cut her nails, Joyce complimented her hands and suggested that trimming her nails might make learning easier. The next week, Babette returned with her nails trimmed, and her mother explained that Babette had never made such a sacrifice for anyone before. Saul Hurok, one of America's top impresarios, handled many temperamental stars, including the great bass singer Fyodor Chaliapin. When Chaliapin complained about being unable to perform, Hurok didn't argue. Instead, he sympathized, offered to cancel the performance, and eventually coaxed Chaliapin onto the stage. As Dr. Arthur Furser Gates wrote in Educational Psychology, sympathy is a universal craving. Children and adults alike seek sympathy for their misfortunes, real or imagined. Understanding this can help you win people over to your way of thinking. Principle 9. Be sympathetic to the other person's ideas and desires.